One of the most problematic things I think we can do in literary spaces today is to police literary taste. An example of this that I saw is when I was reading an article discussing books that are dating red flags, the subtext being dating red flags for men. These are books like A Catcher in the Rye, or A Clockwork Orange, or American Psycho, that for various reasons, either for some personal vendetta manifested in a stereotype about the kinds of readers of these texts, or a sort of moralistic generalization of the contents of these texts, they are deemed unsuitable for readership and something that you should feel shameful for reading and partaking in. But I think this fundamentally gets backwards the relationship that we readers should have to the literary spaces we occupy and the sorts of literature that we partake in. In this lecture, I want to really question to what extent are we responsible to and beholden to the types of literature that we read, and to what extent should literary spaces embody a democratic impulse that subverts this moralistic insistence on policing literary taste? Policing literature has existed for a long time. The Catholic Church has had banned book lists, the Nazis have burned books, and recently, Moms for Liberty here in the States has gone on a rampage against inclusive literature in US schools. And all of these are attempts to homogenize literary spaces and reduce them to some sort of virtuous core, which supposedly is the point of literature, that it is some sort of moral education. I think we get a similarly reductive notion of literary spaces that we typically see in, for example, genre fiction today, where the idea is that literature is supposed to be about pleasure and relaxation and for fun. However, I think that this severely underwrites the value in literary experiences of things like discomfort and displeasure, fear, shock, awe, terror, confusion, and the obstinacy of texts. I think that this forces us, in a very problematic way, to reduce what would otherwise be very transformative literatures to a sort of peripheral status, where they stay away from the status quo. And I think that this is the most reactionary literature that we can have, that which doesn't rock the boat at all. I myself am very interested in these works that rock the boat for a number of reasons, and one of them is the Marquis de Sade's Justine. Now, Justine is about a character named Justine who is emblematic of Christian virtue. She is pious and she is chaste, and she is constantly lambasted by every character in the novel and pillaged, plundered, raped, captured, in order for Sade to show the fallibility of some sort of homogeneous idea of virtue. That virtue does not, in fact, always win out, as, for example, the Christian would like to say. That God reigns supreme. His plan is ensuring that everything goes smoothly. And Sade says, no, we don't have that. So in addition to the classic sadistic imagery of torture scenes, of rape, of all the other things that I've mentioned, we also have very interesting philosophical investigations into the nature of God, of causality, of obligation, of self-interest and self-worth. The duel between good and evil. All of these are thematized in this novel, and many people who would be fundamentally opposed to it just by the cover or by the back cover and reading the description, they would be fundamentally missing out on what I would argue is a very fruitful and interesting literary experience. And it's in fact not just a literary experience. As the postmoderns have showed us, all literature, in fact, all enunciation, all signification, is fundamentally political. All knowledge is situated in a discourse which is historically contingent and which prevents us from speaking however we would like. Speaking is always, in a sense, politically constrained, and the possibility of literature is to analyze and disembark from those constraints, to deconstruct these structures by which we assume that something is simply right. And we can see in the policing of literature an attempt to levy that sort of structure, that status quo that would like to reduce and essentialize literature to good versus evil. But to me, all the great literature shows that there is no such thing as good and evil in the absolute sense. That all we have is the muddle in between, the liminal space that we as readers have to investigate if we really want to know what good and evil are. If we want to have any preliminary notion of how to be a responsible citizen, a good partner, an effective listener, an authentic interpreter, we need to be able to go to the peripheries of what is acceptable in literature. And we have to understand that even the most problematic things can have even the smallest modicum of interesting things to tell us. I don't find this work pleasurable at all. And a lot of people that would be opposed to Saad's writing would say that it is erotic or pornographic and that therefore it is trying to arouse one. But this to me is a straw man, and it is a very, it's a great scapegoat technique. But it in fact totally misconstrues the nature of this kind of literature. Another one of these would be William Burroughs' Naked Lunch. Naked Lunch was the object of an infamous obscenity trial, really the last great obscenity trial in the English-speaking world. And the prosecution argued that this book is pornographic and excessive, and therefore it violates our notions of free speech because pornography is not protected as free speech. But the defense rightly argued this work is not meant to titillate the sort of pleasure centers of us. It is meant to induce shock and awe. It is meant to incite questions, confuse the reader. And we take this for granted in literature. We assume that we are supposed to be able to really see through a book before we even engage in it. The idea that in principle, if we really submitted the literature to a few hours, we would be able to clearly see through and get through it. But works like this, not only do they complicate that because of their sheer excess, but also because they're very difficult. This is a formally complex and a conceptually complex work that I still don't really understand very well. And we take for granted the value of that sort of experience, that literature can open up a space of undecidability, which is not grounded in virtue or truth. It is not anchored in some sort of promise to deliver meaning, for example, but rather it meets us like a person whom we sincerely disagree with, as the possibility for genuine change. That is the efficacy of literature today, is that it is the possibility to effectively meet an other where they're at. Burroughs is in many ways an other from myself. He's a gay man. He's a drug user. He's an expat. He's a very famous author. He's very excessive in ways that I am not. And yet, in these pages, I get an attempt to absorb the other in a way where I get a sense of critical distance. And this is the importance of literature. It is assumed that when someone reads works like these, they are somehow personally invested and interested in them to an obsessive level. That they somehow find it erotically appealing, or it, absorbs some part of their being. But this is a sort of reductive romanticization of literature, that it has to, speak from the heavens like an open cloud that just absorbs you. But no, I would argue that in fact, these sorts of literatures do the reverse. They anchor us down into the world. They show us the depth of the depravity of human behavior and human thought. And they invite us, partially by scaring us, that we have those thoughts too, often daily in various manners, but we are told that we are not allowed to even think those thoughts. And this is why I think that the policing of literary taste has a fundamentally sort of repressively Christian impulse behind it, which is that of thought crime. For in Christianity, you're not even allowed to look lustfully at a woman because that is the same as committing adultery. There is a notion that even your thoughts are condemnable, not simply your actions. And I think that's the impulse behind policing literature like this. The idea that not only can you not read this, but the reason you can't read this is because it would signal to us, whoever us is, that you have these kinds of thoughts. And these kinds of thoughts are dangerous because we don't know how to deal with them. And this takes for granted the careful way by which plenty of readers would engage in this type of work. For example, it's often remarked that something like Naked Lunch is a danger because it incites drug use. Have some people read Naked Lunch and then gone on to try heroin? Possibly. But I would say that a far greater majority of the readers who read Naked Lunch will never participate in any of the stuff in this book. Quite simply because while literature does pull us in, it is not the same as us. It maintains a sense of difference. And we can, as readers, survey this landscape, this environment, as something unique which we are thrust into, something properly otherworldly, and yet nevertheless worldly insofar as it harkens to the conditions of the world we're in, the conditions of police brutality or state violence or capital punishment that Burroughs thematizes in Naked Lunch, for example. And it tells us that we can interact with this world obliquely without conceding to all of its terms, that we can fundamentally be critical of a world. And that's why literatures like this, which are policed, are so strategic and useful, and that I would oblige you, the listener, to read literature like this, because it is the most politically subversive attitude one can have. One that is so radically democratic and pluralistic that it says, I can think what I want, and I cannot be prosecuted for my thoughts. And then, in fact, I am obligated and obliged to open up a space where I can be free to examine my thoughts, where I do not have to be confined by a moralistic repression to my thoughts, but that in fact I can share thoughts with other people. That's what literature is, sharing thoughts with other people. And these sort of literatures challenge us that, look, a lot of people have very weird thoughts, and maybe you will have these kinds of thoughts, maybe you also won't. In that way, literatures like this are a test of self-discovery, an attempt to say that, for example, I myself am not a sadist or a masochist. I don't take sexual pleasure from any of the stuff in either of these books, really. So as such, it is an attempt not only to understand the conditions of our world and the nature of ourself, but it challenges us to democratically invest ourselves in our thoughts and not distance ourselves from them. And one of the things that I want to briefly touch on is the idea of being responsible for our thoughts and the type of literature that we read. Because someone may object that, look, this is a slippery slope. If we just say that this kind of stuff is okay to read, what are we saying is okay in terms of actions? Because certainly, these ideas incite other ideas. No literature happens in a vacuum. And therefore, I do understand the problematic, I don't know, if, say, for example, I was reading a book about Israeli settler colonial violence against Palestinians, and it was just wantonly embracing all sorts of strategies by which to kill Palestinian people. That would make me deeply uncomfortable. But I think that is precisely the point, that these books not only incite discomfort, but if they're good, they self-reflexively force the reader to turn around and reflect upon their feelings of discomfort. It really gets us in touch with our feelings, and rather than pulling us away from our systems of morality, of these sort of virtuous frameworks imposed upon us, they bring them to the fore, and they show that we can tinker with them, but not necessarily that we should destroy them outright. For example, in Justine, one of the characters, Dubois, talks to Thérèse, who is an alter ego of Justine, about how she should abandon all of the fetters that keep her from doing whatever she wants, that she should be willing to pay the price, but that she should respect herself enough to do what is necessary to stay alive and get pleasure. It is an extreme instance of wanton liberty and excess to a problematic extent. And I want to read this passage for you and keep in mind the way it makes you feel, the way it incites and brings to the fore those moralistic frameworks, and puts you in a state of unease. It puts you on your guard. Dubois says, "But as for us, Thérèse, whom barbarous Providence, which you are mad enough to idolize, has condemned to the humiliation of crawling along like the snake in the grass, we who are looked upon with disdain because we are poor, who are treated like slaves because we are weak, we whose lips are moistened only with gall, and whose feet tread upon nothing but thorns, you want us to abstain from crime, when its hand alone can open the door to life, can maintain and preserve us in it, and prevent us from losing it. You want us to remain perpetually submissive and degraded, while the class that dominates us enjoys all fortune's favors, and our lot is nothing but hardship, despondency, and pain, only want, tears, the branding of the criminal, and the scaffold." Right? So she is speaking from a place of indignancy, and her response is to revolt. We can imagine this being a lot more favorable if, for example, it was coming from a slave in the antebellum South. So one of the things that literature like this does, and this example should be a key exemplar of that, is that it forces us to examine the context in which we make ethical statements about literature, about the actions in literature, about our responsibility and our debtorship to those actions and thoughts. So it brings to the fore all sorts of critical impulses, but brings with them the frameworks through which we analyze those impulses. So the problem with policing literary taste is that it assumes that every reader is obliged to and allied with their text. It assumes that every reader approaches the text because they want it, straight up. When in actuality, many readers come to texts for a lot of different reasons. Say, for example, you're not a Muslim, and you go and read the Quran. There are a lot of reasons why you do that, but the first and foremost one might not be pleasure or indulgence. It might be because you're coming from a critical perspective. You want to critique Islam. It may be from a place of childish, pure interest with no necessarily alliance in advance of what you're going to be reading. In this way, we can see that readers are not so obstinately bound to their texts, but rather they exist in a conversation with their texts, where we need to take seriously that readers can actively confront and critique what is in a text. That readers have what it takes to butt up to a text and understand the implications of its discourse and not simply accede to it as an object of pleasure. That it can open up a critical space where we do have a sense of distance, where we are not allied with every single action that happens in a text. We can read something and be disgusted by it or discomforted by it and still appreciate it. So that being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat interesting in thinking about these things. It's been a lot on my mind as I think about the importance and place of the transgressive literature that so excites me and interests me on this channel. So that being said, you can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because it means a lot to me, helps me buy the books necessary to bring you content. That being said, that is it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.